Hello, Spring Mill fourth graders. Um, miss you guys. Miss seeing your happy faces in the library. I hope you're doing well. I've talked to your teachers, and there's a book that they were going to be reading to you in class, and I offered to do that for them. Um, and so they're helping me to talk to you about different parts of the book and so forth. It's a fabulous book. You're really going to enjoy it. It's going to make you think a lot. The book itself is called Number the Stars. It's by Lois Lowry. She's written a lot of wonderful books. It did get the Newbery Award for children's literature, and we do have copies in the library. I wanted to give you a little bit of a background, though, about this book. I think most of you have heard of the Holocaust. Um, this goes back a long time ago, um, almost 100 years ago, in the 1930s to 40s. In a country called Germany, there was a man named Adolf Hitler who was the head of a political party there called the Nazis. And they really believed that they were the most wonderful people in the whole wide world. And they especially didn't like Jewish people. And the Holocaust was a time where around 6 million Jewish people were killed by the Nazis because the Nazis didn't like them and didn't think that they were good people. Horrible time. Um, Adolf Hitler was a dictator. In America, we don't have dictatorship. We have a democracy. That means that we vote on our leaders. But in this country, people didn't get to vote, and he was the leader, and everybody had to do what he said. Um, During that time, Germany invaded a lot of different countries, and they took over a lot of different countries. And this is actually what started World War II, and the United States was a part of World War II. Germany did lose the war, and Adolf Hitler did go out of power, thank goodness. And this is also the time that I know you've heard of the girl named Anne Frank. We have also her diaries in the library. She was actually born in Germany, and then her family moved to Amsterdam to flee Germany when all this was going on, and that's when Amsterdam was invaded. That's when she and her family went into hiding, and she wrote that diary that is so famous. And if you get a chance, um, you should read that or look up the Diary of Anne Frank and find out more about that. Anyway, this particular book, Number the Stars, okay, this takes place in Denmark. And Denmark is also in Europe, and the Nazis were trying to take over Denmark also. And it's about a little girl and her friend, and they live in Copenhagen in Denmark. And you're going to learn a lot about this time in history and how people really felt being treated terribly just because of their beliefs. One of the other things that I want to tell you is as we read this, or as I read this first chapter, I really want you to think about certain things that the author writes in this book and how they affect the way that the book goes and the way that we think. And I'm going to stop at certain parts and have you really think about that. So to start, we have chapter 1, and it is called Why Are You Running? I'll race you to the corner, Ellen. Anne Marie adjusted the thick leather pack on her back so that her school books balanced evenly. Ready? She looked at her best friend. Ellen made a face. No, she said, laughing. You know I can't beat you. My legs aren't as long. Can't we just walk like civilized people? She was a stocky 10-year-old, unlike lanky Anne Marie. We have to practice for the athletic meet on Friday. I know I'm going to win the girls' race this week. I was second last week, but I've been practicing every day. Come on, Ellen, Anne Marie pleaded, eyeing the distance to the next corner of the Copenhagen street. Please? So right there, I'm thinking the author starts off by saying that they're racing, they have their backpacks, their school books. So I'm thinking that they're coming where? From where? Must be leaving school, going home, walking home. A lot of kids did that at that time. Ellen hesitated and then nodded and shifted her own rucksack of books against her shoulders. Oh, all right. Ready, she said. Go, shouted Anne Marie, and the two girls were off, racing along the residential sidewalk. Residential means it's in a residential area, meaning where people live. Anne Marie's silvery blonde hair flew behind her, and Ellen's dark pigtails bounced against her shoulders. Wait for me, wailed little Kirsty, left behind, but the two older girls weren't listening. Anne Marie outdistanced her friend quickly, even though one of her shoes came untied as she sped along the street called Osterbrigade, past the small shops and cafes of her neighborhood here in northeast Copenhagen. Laughing, she skirted an elderly lady in black who carried a shopping bag made of string. A young woman pushing a baby carriage moved aside to make way. The corner was just ahead. Anne Marie looked up, panting, just as she reached the corner. Her laughter stopped. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. Halt! The soldier ordered in a stern voice. So they're walking along. There's the shops and a lady with her bag and a woman pushing the baby. It kind of seems like it's just a normal day, right? And then all of a sudden, halt, we know what halt means, stop, by a soldier. So I'm thinking that by that, the author's telling us that something's not right here. The German word was as familiar as it was frightening. Anne Marie had heard it often enough before, but it had never been directed at her until now. Behind her, Ellen also slowed and stopped. Far back, little Kirsty was plodding along, her face in a pout because the girls hadn't waited for her. Anne Marie stared up, and there were two of them. That meant two helmets, two sets of cold eyes glaring at her, and four tall, shiny boots planted firmly on the sidewalk, blocking her path towards home. And it meant two rifles, gripped in the hands of the soldiers. She stared at the rifles first, and then finally she looked into the face of the soldier who had ordered her to halt. How would you feel if that were you? That would be terrifying, wouldn't it? Why are you running? The harsh voice asked. His Danish was very poor. 3 years, Anne Marie thought with contempt. 3 years they've been in our country and they still can't speak our language. I was racing with my friend, she answered politely. We have races at school every Friday, and I want to do well, so I... Her voice trailed away, the sentence unfinished. Don't talk so much, she told herself. Just answer them, that's all. She glanced back. Ellen was motionless on the sidewalk, a few yards behind her. Farther back, Kirsty was still sulking and walking slowly toward the corner. Nearby, a woman had come to the doorway of a shop and was standing silently watching. One of the soldiers, the taller one, moved toward her. Anne Marie recognized him as the one she and Ellen always called in whispers the giraffe. Because of his height and the long neck that extended from his stiff collar, he and his partner were always on this corner. He prodded the corner of her backpack with the stock of his rifle. Anne Marie trembled. What is in here? He asked loudly. From the corner of her eye, she saw the shopkeeper move quietly back into the shadows of the doorway, out of sight. School books, she answered truthfully. Are you a good student? The soldier asked, and he seemed to be sneering at her. Yes. What is your name? Anne Marie Johansson. Your friend, is she a good student too? He was looking behind her at Ellen, who hadn't moved. Anne Marie looked back too and saw that Ellen's face, usually rosy-cheeked, was pale, and her dark eyes were wide. She nodded at the soldier. Better than me, she said. What's her name? Ellen. And who is this? He asked, looking to Anne Marie's side. Kirsty had appeared there suddenly, scowling at everyone. My little sister. She reached down for Kirsty's hand, but Kirsty, always stubborn, refused it and put her hands on her hips defiantly. The soldier reached down and stroked her little sister's short, tangled curls. Stand still, Kirsty, Anne Marie ordered silently, praying that somehow the obstinate 5-year-old would receive the message. But Kirsty reached up and pushed the soldier's hand. Don't, she said loudly. I'm thinking right now that Anne Marie is probably panicking because she knows enough about these soldiers that she has to be polite. and nice so that they don't hurt her. And then her little sister is kind of being kind of, nasty and saying, get away kind of things. And I think she's probably pretty afraid. Both soldiers began to laugh. They spoke to each other in rapid German that Anne Marie couldn't understand. She is pretty, like my own little girl, the tall one said in a more pleasant voice. Anne Marie tried to smile politely. Go home, all of you. Go study your school books and don't run. You look like hoodlums when you run. The two soldiers turned away. Quickly, Anne Marie reached down again and grabbed her sister's hand before Kirsty could resist. Hurrying the little girl along, she rounded the corner. In a moment, Ellen was beside her. They walked quickly, not speaking, with Kirsty between them, toward the large apartment building where both families lived. So now I'm getting kind of a picture in my head of the setting. So they were coming from school. So the school must be close to where they live. And they go down a couple streets and then they have their apartment building. So, and we know that there's some stores and things like that. So I'm picturing a small town. Seems kind of a friendly town other than the soldiers. When they were almost home, Ellen whispered suddenly, I was so scared. Me too, Anne Marie whispered back. As they turned to enter their building, both girls looked straight ahead toward the door. They did it purposely, so that they would not catch the eyes or the attention of two more soldiers, who stood with their guns on this corner as well. Kirsty scurried ahead of them through the door, chattering about the picture she was bringing home from kindergarten to show Mama. For Kirsty, the soldiers were simply part of the landscape, something that had always been there on every corner, as unimportant as lampposts throughout her remembered life. Are you going to tell your mother? Ellen asked Anne Marie as they trudged together up the stairs. I'm not. My mother would be upset. No, I won't either. Mama would probably scold me for running on the street. She said goodbye to Ellen on the second floor, where Ellen lived, and continued on to the third, practicing in her mind a cheerful greeting for her mother, a smile, a description of today's spelling test, in which she had done well. But she was too late. Kirsty had gotten there first. And he poked Anne Marie's book bag with his gun, and then he grabbed my hair. Kirsty was chattering as she took off her sweater in the center of the apartment living room. But I wasn't scared. Anne Marie was, and Ellen too, but not me. Mrs. Johansson rose quickly from the chair by the window where she'd been sitting. Mrs. Rosen, Ellen's mother, was there too, in the opposite chair. They'd been having coffee together as they did many afternoons. Of course, it wasn't real coffee, though the mothers still called it that, having coffee. There had been no real coffee in Copenhagen since the beginning of the Nazi occupation, not even real tea. The mothers sipped at hot water flavored with herbs. Anne Marie, what happened? What is Kirsty talking about? Her mother asked anxiously. Where's Ellen? Mrs. Rosen had a frightened look. Ellen's in your apartment. She didn't realize you were here, Anne Marie explained. Don't worry, it wasn't anything. It was the two soldiers who stand on the corner of Osterbrigade. You've seen them. You know, the tall one with the long neck, the one who looks like a silly giraffe. She told her mother and Mrs. Rosen of the incident, trying to make it sound humorous and unimportant, but their uneasy looks didn't change. Why do you suppose that she is trying to make it like it's no big deal? Have you ever had something happen where you don't really want to tell your parent, but you need to, and so you kind of make it not as big of a deal as maybe it really is because you don't want to worry them? I think maybe that's what's going on here, don't you? I wonder how things would be different if she acted terrified. If she told her mom in a terrified way, how do you think her mother would react to that? I slapped his hand and shouted at him, Kirsty announced importantly. No, she didn't, Mama, Anne Marie reassured her mother. She's exaggerating, as she always does. Mrs. Johansson moved to the window and looked down to the street below. The Copenhagen neighborhood was quiet. It looked the same as always. People coming and going from the shops, children at play, the soldiers on the corner. She spoke in a low voice to Ellen's mother. They must be edgy because of the latest resistance incidents. Did you read in Die Freie Danske about the bombings in Hillerød and Nørrebro? Although she pretended to be absorbed in unpacking her school books, Anne Marie listened, and she knew what her mother was referring to. Die Freie Danske. the Free Danes, was an illegal newspaper. Illegal means they couldn't have it, it was against the law. Peter Nielsen brought it to them occasionally, carefully folded and hidden among ordinary books and papers, and Mamma always burned it after she and Papa had read it. But Anne Marie heard Mamma and Papa talk, sometimes at night, about the news they received that way, news of sabotage against the Nazis, bombs hidden and exploded in the factories that produced war materials, and industrial railroad lines damaged so that the goods couldn't be transported. It's really interesting. So there's this illegal newspaper. Why would people dare to get this and read it if there were obviously going to be some serious repercussions if they got caught? Because it even says that after they read it, they burned it. So obviously they didn't want anybody to know that they had this. That's kind of important to the story, isn't it? The author tells us that because she wants us to understand how serious this really was. Oh, my dog is dreaming. I hear her making little sounds. Also, I love how in some books it says news of sabotage against the Nazis. And so I'm thinking that some of you guys might be thinking, what is sabotage? But the author goes ahead to give you some examples. Bombs hidden and exploded in the factories that produced war materials. The railroad lines were damaged. So sabotage must mean it has something to do with people coming in and doing things to damage or destroy other things. And she knew what resistance meant. Papa had explained when she overheard the word and asked. The resistance fighters were Danish people. No one knew who because they were very secret, who were determined to bring harm to the Nazis however they could. They damaged the German trucks and cars and bombed their factories, and they were very brave. Sometimes they were caught and killed. I know I've read several stories to you guys about people in history who have taken extraordinary measures for peace, to try to make things right. And sometimes these people get killed. And we've talked about how that would be so difficult, but so extremely brave to be able to stand up and fight for what you believed in, not fighting necessarily being violence, but fighting with words, fighting with beliefs, knowing that something might happen to you or your family. That would be really tough to do. I must go and speak to Ellen, Mrs. Rosen said, moving toward the door. You girls walk a different way to school tomorrow. Promise me, Anne Marie, and Ellen will promise too. We will, Mrs. Rosen, but what does it matter? There are German soldiers on every corner. They will remember your faces, Mrs. Rosen said, turning in the doorway to the hall. It is important to be one of the crowd, always. Be one of many. Be sure that they never have a reason to remember your face. She disappeared into the hall and closed the door behind her. He'll remember my face, Mama, Kirsty announced happily, because he said I looked like his little girl. He said I was pretty. If he has such a pretty little girl, why doesn't he go back to her like a good father? Mrs. Johansson murmured, stroking Kirsty's cheek. Why doesn't he go back to his own country? Mama, is there anything to eat? Anne Marie asked, hoping to take her mother's mind away from the soldiers. Take some bread and give a piece to your sister. With butter? Kirsty asked hopefully. No butter, her mother replied. You know that. Kirsty sighed as Anne Marie went to the bread box in the kitchen. I wish I could have a cupcake, she said, a big yellow cupcake with pink frosting. Her mother laughed. For a little girl, you have a long memory, she told Kirsty. There hasn't been any butter or sugar for cupcakes for a long time, a year at least. When will there be cupcakes again? When the war ends, Mrs. Johansson said. She glanced through the window down to the street corner where the soldiers stood, their faces impassive beneath the metal helmets. When the soldiers leave. They were just talking about not having sugar and butter. Remember, the mothers didn't really have real coffee, and their tea was just water with herbs. So during a wartime, the country, has to spend their money on the soldiers and the protection for uniforms and things to protect themselves, and they don't have enough money then for the things that people really want and sometimes really need. A lot of countries that go through war are very, very destroyed and poor at the end because they've had to spend all their money trying to stay safe. So that's just one more thing other than this family worrying about, what's going on. They're also having to struggle with having food to eat and so forth. So lots of things to think about after this first chapter. I want you especially to think about um, how these little things impact the plot of the story. The plot is kind of the big idea in the story. So we know that this is about these horrible people who are coming in and they're trying to take over this country. And we hear little things about, how the mothers react to the girls. And we think about how Anne Marie, when the soldier talked to her, I would feel like I wanted to be kind of mean back to him, but she was trying to be really polite and kind. So think about how those things support this plot of the story. They help us to understand how serious the situation was. Anyway, I'm going to read the next chapter and put it on the next video. It is called Who is the Man Who Rides Past? Another thing I've noticed about these chapters in her book, here you can see them, a lot of them are questions. I guess sometimes when I write, I don't really think about making a title a question, but it's kind of a good idea. Think about that. It makes you really think about what might happen, doesn't it? Anyway, I'll talk to you guys soon. Keep in touch and let me know if you need anything.